Difficulty. It's something that's hard to talk about with Genshin because for the most part, if you talk about game difficulty, if you talk about endgame content, a lot of people assume you're complaining and want to quit or should quit. But I think the argument itself is more nuanced than that. I don't believe difficulty just equates to more Spiral Abyss floors or more content like Spiral Abyss, because I do believe there are other ways that you can just add more content or change things that allows individuals to fully test the potential of their characters. And I believe that if this wasn't going to be implemented before Sumeru, it should have been implemented now. Because of how much Dendro has changed things and how easy it has arguably made certain things, don't get me wrong, the Abyss is still difficult. I still cannot 36 star the Abyss. And I also know plenty of people who can't. I can 35 star it or 34 star, and I have 36 started once, but not consistently enough to where I can say, oh yeah, it's easy content. So if you can't clear Abyss, don't think that I am immediately saying, oh yeah, this applies to something harder than that, because no, I believe the Abyss is supposed to be a DPS check at most times, and the enemies have so much HP, it is a lot of times unrealistic, especially with enemies like the Weenuts. Outside of that, let's take a look at events, and let's specifically look at the ways in which some of them were good. The Triple Mangukenki event was great because you could individually choose buffs and or debuffs, different time constraints, different enemy allotments, different HP allowance. You could actively increase the difficulty, and we saw something similar to this before with the Hypostasis event, not the one that recently happened, but the one that was ages ago where a lot of people complained because we couldn't do the hardest difficulty at the time. It seems like over time, Genshin Impact has dramatically altered the way it's handled events, from large-scale battles or extremely difficult modifications to much easier casual content, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing. But what I think they need to do is keep both. You can have both. If you intend on making difficult content and casual content, you can just make the difficult content more geared towards the higher level, similar to how in events you can choose which level you want to partake in. We have bounties, which is a good system in the game because let's be honest here, if you actually take the moment to look at a bounty, and let's say hypothetically you're running a team of Yelan with Raiden, Hu Tao, and I don't know, Xiao. These are 4 separate elements. They're all main DPSs, don't get me wrong, and they all require a lot of field time. But if we're looking at the bounty, the contract may state it's immune to electro damage and takes additional damage from bow wielding characters. In that instance, your Yelan would probably be the most likely character for you to use. Bounties themselves have interesting mechanics. Outside of the tracking thing in Leo and Mondstadt, which is absolutely awful, bounties restricting or buffing certain things is actually pretty good. I just think the bounties themselves need more HP. The permanent content we did get, which is TCG, doesn't necessarily have enough rewards long term for you to continue doing after you reach max level. But if you were to implement Theater Mechanicus, or at least have the rewards for TCG be refreshed like Spiral Abyss, that would actually make it more intriguing, or at least people would participate more. If every week or every 2 weeks like Spiral Abyss, you had TCG reset and the challengers end up giving you primo gems if you can beat them within certain constraints like not losing a teammate or whatever, I think people would legitimately play the game mode more. We just don't have that as of yet. The events give you a bunch of small enemies, and the small enemies themselves are fine, but the big enemies are the ones that give us trouble. If you implemented a boss stage in which you had the cryo hypostasis mixed with the hydro one and the pyro one, we would either be vaporized, melted, or frozen. And that can dramatically change how you approach the situation because you really need a healer. Or if we had enemies that actively utilize the elemental reactions against us. Think about the consecrated beast with the overload. We all hated that. And I don't think this is something that's exclusive to the Abyss or exclusive to the overworlds, because let's be honest here, has any of you legitimately done the new artifact domain for the Vorakasha set? It is one of, if not the most disappointing domains I've ever done. And I want to take all of us back to Viridescent domain and Tenacity at the Middle Left domain. Both of these domains are great. Tenacity has 2 Geovishapes that you fight, which have decent HP pools. Yeah, it can be a short fight if you one-shot them with a Eula or a big Raiden burst, but for the most part, it can legitimately be interesting. I just think they need a faster phase 2 transition. But if we're talking about the Viridescent domain, the amount of enemies in the System Mage and the Pyro Fatui agent mean that you can be overloaded. The treasure hoarders will constantly throw stuff at you and slowly space themselves out. And yes, it's a Venti domain, don't get me wrong. But I think by making newer enemies so resistant to Venti, by making them big and heavy, it's arbitrarily made content a little bit more easy because they want to limit the number of enemies. They're not going to throw 8 enemies that are super big like the Kairagi and Inazuma at you. Instead, they're going to throw 2 Kairagi with a bunch of smaller enemies at you. And that's not necessarily a good thing because yes, it's more approachable from a casual perspective, but it doesn't necessarily mean the content is more fun. I think all of us like the fun of the Viridescent domain. You go in there, you use any animal character, you group them up, and that's it. but they don't necessarily have that anymore. There's less fun factor, and it feels a bit more like a chore with different domains. I think the Sumo World bosses are actually pretty interesting. The new one, I don't like it. It's awful. Like, as in, it just feels too easy. But everything else I like. The Jade Plume Terror Shroomer is great as an enemy. The way it reacts to your attacks, the different berserker stages it goes into, I legitimately like that. The Electra Regisvine is actually a decent boss because it does have a lot of HP, at least if you don't use cryo. The mechanics of the Drake are pretty good. I just think it needs or could do with more HP. I think one of the things they could solve is, instead of just dramatically amping up all of the other world's bosses, they could instead do something like where the Cryo Regisvine, if you're fighting it, summons Cryo Whopper Flowers. So that way when you're attacking it, you actually have to deal with other smaller enemies in the area attacking you. Whilst the boss itself may be significantly easier than the Sumeru ones, it legitimately does have a bit more complexity or more difficulty because you can be stun locked. The same could go for Hypostasis. I think that some of them are really decent. The Geo Hypostasis, let's be honest here, it sucks. It's awful. It sucks to get to, it sucks to fight. But a lot of the other ones could do with more enemies. Maybe the Animal Hypostasis has random elemental Whopper Flowers surrounding it that occasionally will be drawn into the fight if you drift too close to the edges. You're incentivized to stay in the center of the arena that way, however if you do you may take more damage. Small insignificant changes like this. I am firm in the belief that Genshin Impact does not need to add for 13, 14, and 15, but I can state that I would be perfectly fine if they reset Abyss weekly. The Primo Gems would add up, you'd be able to test out new things more often to get them, and if you did that, in addition to making TCG a weekly reset thing like Abyss, where the challengers gave you Primo Gems for completing them, and then they made one of, if not any of the events permanent, hypothetically it could be the Hypostasis event, it could be Maho Kenki event, it could be Theater Mechanicus, it could be legitimately any of the actual combat-oriented events, we would have a better system. I think that bounty should reset a bit more. I believe that a lot of the systems in the game that we've either previously had in events or as of right now do have can be great to suffice for end game or more difficult content. I just believe that the game itself needs to meet that threshold. World bosses need more HP or more resistances. Domains for artifacts need to significantly improve in their difficulty spectrum because as of right now, 3 enemies or 2 enemies that are slightly larger than normal aren't sufficing. I want to hear your thoughts as well, don't get me wrong, but as for me, I am perfectly fine with certain areas. I think that the hardest weekly bosses we have is either going to be Aishtaha or Raiden. I can't speak of the Nahida second act boss, but I can speak that Wanderer / Scaramouche boss fight is absolutely easier than fighting his sister, which is vaguely disappointing but also makes sense considering he was the prototype. But anyway, I think that if you were to switch some of that stuff around, even if hypothetically, let's say they don't want to change anything about the domains, what if they change overworld? Let's say the world of Teyvat is so easy to walk around and the enemies are fine, but Dragonspine, the enemies are buffed due to Durin being there. And Enkonomiya, the enemies are about twice as hard due to it not being, technically speaking, in the realm of the 7. That could add a bit more complications to things. Even if you had the chasm itself, the underground layer of the chasm be more difficult, that could also be a thing. I don't know. I'm not complaining. I've been playing this game since like day one and I'm legitimately having fun. I do enjoy myself. I just think that yes, difficulty is something that should be discussed, but it shouldn't always be discussed in the mindset of quitting the game or just saying Genshin Impact's too easy, I don't like this, whatever. I think that constellations, if you have them, make the game easier. So if you have like a C6 Yelan or a C6 Ganyu, theoretically, then at that point, you can't complain about difficult content because if difficult content is made to match your constellation level, at least as a C6er, then everyone else who doesn't have that won't be able to complete it. I don't think rewards should be locked off like that. I think that instead, if you made difficult content, but for completing it, you got something like 100 or 200,000 more in addition to XP books, that would be fine. And then make the Primogem reward still at the same level as other people, save for the Abyss, mind you, and TCG. But what are your thoughts? Tell me in the comments down below. Tell me whether or not you like difficult content or whether or not you just want more things to do without resin. Either way, am interested to hear. Consider subbing and heading over to the Discord server, and I'll see you next time.